I'm Brittany Salisbury. I'm curator of prints and drawings, and I took over Picasso paper about a year and a half ago after William Robinson's retirement. He was the curator of European paintings. I've been working on it for many years. And Jillian Cruzy will be giving your tour today. She's a graduate curatorial fellow and worked really closely with me on the exhibition and has really sort of spearheaded the figuring out the logistics of what the tour will be, because it is a challenging exhibition to tour. It is enormous, and I guess the one piece of advice I would impart to you, having given now many tours of the show over the past week and a half, you have to get through it in less than an hour. You have to move fast. It's you can't do it in under an hour unless you really keep moving. And what I've kind of been doing is instead of pointing out individual, I'll talk about an individual piece in a gallery, but I kind of end up talking about each gallery as a whole, and you just kind of get through it that way. And I always warn people at the beginning, as I'm doing now, that it'll feel like I'm going quickly, but I want to make sure that we can get through. I want to be respectful of everyone's time and make sure that we can get through in under an hour. And it is possible, but even when I feel like I'm going really quickly, I end up hitting pretty close to an hour. So Jillian will show you how we do it, and
yeah, it's also, remember that it's okay that if you're running a little bit behind, that there might be galleries that you skip, and that's just what ends up happening, and you can make that choice whether it's something that's less interesting to you. That's definitely an option to take. So with that, we'll go ahead and go inside the galleries and get started. Many of you probably know this exhibition is a long time coming, so it was a collaboration between the Musée National Picasso Paris, the Royal Academy in London, and of course the Cleveland Museum of Art. It opened initially in London, but because of the pandemic, it actually closed only after a few weeks, even though the exhibition had some really great critical reception. The exhibition here really becomes, because of that, the only kind of venue of Picasso and paper in the United States, but also in some ways the only venue for Picasso and paper. And so the exhibition looks at this major 20th century artist through a new lens, so thinking about his lifelong engagement with paper, not just as a regular kind of drawing support, but as a material and in many ways as a muse. So Picasso was often inspired by paper. You see him working through ideas, so puts a lot of the kind of paintings and sculptures that we're more familiar with in his work into a new context. It's often also the place where he's the most experimental, and we'll see that throughout the exhibition. Picasso was born in 1881 in Spain into a family, a bourgeois family. His father was actually a painter, museum curator, and a drawing instructor. So Picasso had instruction in art from very early on, and he was somewhat of a child prodigy, but benefited from his father's expertise. You can point out on this wall over here, if you look back, we have an instance of Picasso creating a more sort of traditional sort of drawing. So he's looking at plaster casts, so he's having that very kind of traditional training. Often people kind of joke that Picasso couldn't draw, and that, oh, I could do that, because we're more familiar with his kind of Cubist works or later works. But we have this academic study and many other instances in which we see that Picasso could draw, and he actually made that drawing at about 13 years old. So we see the ways in which he's really able to do this traditional work. He studies at academies, although he doesn't go to class perhaps as often as he was supposed to go. But so he has that background in traditional art training. This room is largely looking at Picasso's blue period. I know you all will be very familiar with La Vie, but where his period, the blue period is really his first kind of specific period that shows a specific style in his work. It's from about 1901 to 1904, and obviously the painting has these often cool blue tones, elongated figures, often dealing with aspects of life of poverty and despair. And this is in part tied to his biography, and much of Picasso's work is tied to his biography. So at the time, he's living in between Barcelona and Paris and struggling as an artist. His parents at this point were kind of disappointed in the way that his art was going, so he was cut off from parental funding for a while. So he's really struggling as an artist, and we see that in many of the subject matter of his blue period. Again, I know you all are familiar with this work, but it's really the kind of the pinnacle of his blue period. When people outside of Cleveland who study Picasso think of Cleveland, this is the work that they think of. And it has various different interpretations. It's often very ambiguous, whether it is an image of sacred and profane love, a cycle of life, the child, young lovers, mother, and then kind of older figures. Or, as we see from these drawings here, there are also elements coming of the artist's studio. So we see in these earlier sketches, one from the Musée Picasso in Paris and one from the Picasso Museum in Barcelona, that Picasso initially envisioned the scene as being in an artist's studio. We see the easel, and this one in particular, we see him kind of pointing up to the heavens, which is a gesture that's frequently seen in art and has this idea of the artist as the arbiter between art and life, but also heaven and earth. And so we see this early iteration of Picasso's work and the way that he's working through the composition. We also know that the figure of the art of the male figure here was initially Picasso himself, but after the tragic suicide of his friend Carlos Casagemas, over the kind of unrequited love for this figure here, Germain, that Picasso did change the facial features to Casagemas. In this gallery as well, you could possibly point out, this is a very early etching by Picasso called The Frugal Meal. It's made on a zinc plate, which would have been much cheaper than a typical copper plate, and it's actually a reused zinc plate. So if you, in your mind, if you turn it 90 degrees, you can actually see little marks of grass, and it was a landscape that was used by another artist that is lesser known than Picasso. It was also sometimes printed in blue, but you can see that in this period, Picasso is starting to experiment not just with drawing and painting, but also with printmaking techniques.
Quick question. So did he burnish the old plate smooth before he then started working on it?
You know, I'm not sure if he did it himself
Mm-hmm.
or if somebody might have helped him with it. So he was working with a professional printer at this time, and it's part of a larger theme in his work of collaboration with printers in particular. I don't know if you know.
It probably would have been burnished.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay.
And like his friend probably used the plate and had it sitting around and just gave it to him to use. So it's probably like the most economical way you can
Sure.
make an etching, like a reused zinc plate.
So I've seen that image before and it's been blue. Is there a painting of it or it's just this in a blue, with blue
There's a
ink?
painting that's related to it. I don't remember what collection it's in, but it has also been printed in blue. And this is part of a kind of larger tradition in the end of the 19th century of beginning to print in color. All right, with that, we'll move on to the next gallery. I know it's kind of slow.
There's stools now if you want to.
So as we're moving through the galleries, you're getting the kind of progression of Picasso's work. This gallery is the Rose period. So following the blue period, Picasso actually meets, it's rosy for a couple of reasons. Picasso actually meets Fernand Olivier, a woman at the Bachelor Lavoir, which was a kind of conglomerate of artist studio in a very shabby, large building. And he makes Fernando Olivier there, who he actually depicts in our drawing that's just over here, and in a number of the works in this particular period. He meets and falls in love with her, so his outlook on life is a little bit rosier. But we also see he made a trip to Gozo, so if you look at this work just here, Gozo in the Pyrenees in Spain, and the countryside there had this kind of pinky ochre color, so he's taking inspiration both from the love in his life and from his surroundings. So the DNA is really strong in Rose period works, and you'll see here these two and this drawing there are ours. There are other works as well. The Head of the Boy behind you, which you're probably familiar with. But we see during the Rose period Picasso being really experimental with the materials that he's working with. So with our painting the harem, he's drawing in painting. You see these kind of these outlines on bodies, and then with drawing material, which we see in this work here, he's actually working more so as you would with painting. And this work, I'm sure you might get questions about why it's laying like this. And Picasso was so experimental that we don't necessarily know or fully understand everything that he's doing in this period in particular. And so a lot of these Rose period works are really fragile. And so it was determined by our paper conservator, Mina Stanton, that we couldn't have this vertically on the wall because of a risk to the work itself, in particular with paint flaking. And so that's why we have this presentation here, where it's in a case at an angle, but it actually creates a really nice view with this work, the harem, for which it is a study, and you can see the way that that figure is shown in the harem as well. Behind you in this case, we have some really fantastic sketchbook from the Musée Picasso in Paris, and that is, again, a study for the harem, this same figure, who was Fernand Olivier, so this romantic partner, and Brittany has added into the exhibition this really fantastic book and image self-portrait of Fernand Olivier, so she made art herself, and later wrote a book about Picasso. So in that case there you have a really nice image of her, as well as she appears in the photograph of the case. Any questions about the Rose period before we move on? I know it's quick, it's real quick. Okay. So this is looking at Picasso's one of his most famous painting, the Demoiselle d'Avignon. And while we don't have the painting itself here, it lives at MoMA. We do have this kind of large didactic here that shows the painting. But what we do have, I think, is really special. We have preparatory and related works to the painting. So in this case, we have several sketchbooks, and Picasso actually worked through Demoiselle d'Avignon for an extended period of time. He created 16 sketchbooks, all devoted to this subject matter, in which he's thinking through the composition. So the painting originally had 7 figures instead of 5, which included 2 men. One a sailor, which you can see an image of the sailor here, another a medical student holding a skull. You also see him working through abstracting the faces. So you can see in particular in this sketchbook here, a kind of more mask-like face. And so this painting, as you may well be aware, was incredibly controversial at the time that Picasso created it, around 1907. Partly because of its subject matter, but also because of its style. So the original title of the Demoiselle d'Avignon was actually the Philosophical Brothel. And so there was this very overt reference to brothels, and Demoiselle d'Avignon, it was renamed. Avignon is not speaking to Avignon, the city in France, but actually a street in Barcelona that was part of the red light district. So a slightly more veiled reference to what is being depicted in the painting. Here we have this final study for it from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, in which we see the 5 sex workers who are very clearly propositioning the viewer that removal of the 2 male figures that I talked about earlier is important in creating that confrontation, because the viewer then takes the place of those 2 male figures. And then, in addition to this subject matter, we see Picasso abstracting some of the faces to these masculine figures. So he is at this point in time looking at Iberian sculpture. You can see some examples over there of this figure that's directly behind you. But he's also looking at African art, in particular from West and Central Africa and the colonies. And I highly encourage you, Kristen Windmuller-Luna is giving a lunchtime lecture on January 7th about Picasso, his African influences, and French colonialism that I think will be really fantastic and will give some really wonderful background for you as well. So Picasso in this time was visiting the Ethnographic Museum in Paris, and while he later denies the connection with African masks and sculpture, we know that he was looking at it at this time and begins collecting around this time. We also know that Matisse and André Derain also had sculptures that Picasso viewed, and you can see him working through one, drawing one over there, and the drawing just next to it, you see the kind of figure. And so this Demoiselle d'Avignon was incredibly controversial, not just for the subject matter, but because what Picasso is doing here, this precursor to the later Cubism. And one of his friends talked about this painting. His friends who saw it in his studio were absolutely disgusted and horrified. And one of his friends described it as if seeing a painting through after drinking gasoline. Oh. And the work actually stayed in his studio for quite a long time before it was exhibited anywhere because of that very kind of negative reaction. Other images in this gallery, or other works in this gallery, you really start to see Picasso breaking up the female form into geometric shapes and planes, which will lead us into the next gallery, Cubism. Are there any questions before we head on?
Do you know when that first went on exhibit and where?
It wasn't for like over a decade.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
1937.
No, it was like 1917. She has 16, 17. It was about a decade after he made it. He showed it in the Salon de in Paris, but he kept it sort of hidden away for a long time after.
So I actually read that Kahnweiler saw it when he had painted it and wanted to buy it, and Picasso wouldn't sell it.
That's possible. He sold it to Jean Musset, who was like a famous French collector of modern art. He sold it to him in 1924, I think, and Doucet had it until Mama bought it.
All right, I think we'll go ahead and move on to the next gallery. All right, so this next gallery looks at Cubism, which I think most people will think, when they think about Picasso, will think about Cubism as one of the most important stylistic inventions of the 20th century. So this wall that we have here has wonderful examples of the kind of 2 different types of Cubism that Picasso was exploring during this period from about 1909 to 1914. On this half of the wall from this painting kind of forward, we're looking at the first style of Cubism known as analytic Cubism. So this is in which they're kind of breaking apart reality into planes and geometric forms. So Brittany has this great example that she gives in which, think of a mirror that's been dropped and broken apart, and you're putting back the pieces together, those kind of fragments, and you're seeing multiple viewpoints all at the same time. So it's really a meditation on the nature of vision. If you think about a guitar, for example, if you look at it straight on, you only see certain aspects of it, but if you turn and move your head around, you're going to see the kind of curl, or not the curl, you're going to see the pegs, you'll see the sides differently. So we're getting all of those different ways you would see all at one time. The analytic cubism is often much more kind of monochrome tones, and it can be difficult to fully understand what it is we're looking at. It's often through the titles or words that might be incorporated that we understand, that our mind starts to make sense of the image that we're seeing. So for example, here, the man with guitar. And it's with that that we can start to kind of pick out those different elements. You can kind of see here the neck of the guitar. On this side of the wall, we have Picasso's experimentation. Oh, I should mention, he was not working on Cubism alone. He was working very closely with another artist named Georges Braque, and they were working through ideas together. Their styles are so similar in this period that it can actually be difficult to tell them apart, and they didn't necessarily always sign their work. So even specialists who focus on these artists can sometimes have difficulties.
Do we know why they were using this monochromatic colored palette?
Because it helps to kind of focus your attention onto the planes, and it further abstracts from reality.
When you're saying it, you look at the titles, we can get more sense. Do you think he really wanted us to make sense out of it by looking at the title, or just wanted us to study it?
You know, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's the possibility for both answers to be right. That he might have wanted people just to experience it, but they're also given these titles at the same time that help us to break them apart or help us to further understand. I believe so.
I mean, I think he's like, you would never have time to get into this tour, but he's doing this bigger project where he sees himself as continuing what Paul Cézanne is doing in post-impressionism and questioning the very essence of vision and what perception means, what it means to look at something and comprehend it through visual signs. So it's part of this bigger, almost semiological thing that's going on. So it's, I think he's trying to challenge the viewer. I think he wants us to look closely and look at this thing that's kind of difficult to look at and figure out what it is, to go through the process. Yeah.
All right, so on this side of the wall, we have what's called synthetic cubism. So he's working through this in 1912, 1914, in which we're looking more so, or they're starting to use collage, so these different pieces of paper, whether it is wallpaper or often newspaper, and sometimes the newspapers might have commentary or relate in some way, as a sort of pun to the objects that's being depicted. The objects are it's more obvious what they are, but they're very clearly two-dimensional in this period. We have in here a particularly interesting object that I would encourage you to point out, because it's also a play on paper, the nature of paper itself. So you'll notice that there's this kind of glow coming from it. It's because there's a light box behind it. If we didn't have the light box, it would just show as a blank piece of paper. And what Picasso has done is he's taken this cutout of a violin and sandwiched it between two pieces of paper, and is playing with the idea of a watermark. So the mark of a paper's manufacturer, that you can actually see one right here, that you see within the paper itself, and can only really be seen with transmitted light. And so he's made his own sort of watermark with this violin sandwiched between the two pieces of paper, and through this we see how familiar Picasso was with paper and how kind of playful he was with it. You can also point out this wonderful sculpture that he's made of a guitar made out of different types of paper, including wallpaper. There's newsprint on the sides and strings. Any questions? Paul, you really can't leave this this space without mentioning this work here. So this is a costume that was designed by Picasso. This is a reconstruction from the 70s, but on his original designs for a ballet called Parade. So Picasso, in around 1917, began working with the Ballet Russe, which was an avant-garde ballet company run by Sergei Diaghilev. And he was commissioned to make the costumes for this ballet, which you can see an excerpt of it on the screen over there, that had a story by the poet Jean Cocteau and a score by Eric Satie, including sounds of the modern world. So sounds of cars backfiring and typewriters and machines whirring. And that's part of the kind of synthetic cubism that Picasso carries over into this, of elevating kind of everyday objects into fine art. And the story of Parade is that 3 different managers, this is the American manager, attempt to get people to come into their traveling show. So Parade were the kind of comedic show that tries to encourage visitors to see some sort of entertainment. And they all try but fail. And it's a commentary on kind of life as a modern artist and the inability to get kind of audience traction. This is a wonderful loan from the Opera Museum in Paris, and when they brought it in, they actually, and were unpacking it, they were telling us that the dancers actually hate wearing these costumes because they're incredibly difficult to move in, and then you see right here in the middle between the 2 kind of red collaged parts on there, you see the screen, and that's actually where the dancer would see out of. So imagine trying to dance in this heavy, kind of awkward costume, but it was a part of this larger avant-garde theater theater and ballet, in which we were bringing modern art into the ballet.
I have just a technical question. That's so loud that when we were over there, it was hard to hear you. Is it possible to turn the sound down on that video? It's really
People were talking. And people talking too.
yeah, but that's going to happen when we do a tour.
Yeah, I mean, this is the level that that design settled on.
And you're gonna have listening devices. We
Oh,
just don't
okay.
have them today. I'm
Oh, all
sorry.
right. Okay.
That was my
Makes it
fault. I
better.
need to get the new set ready to go.
it's waiting. It's tricky, but the
But
listening device-
that answers the question. We have listening devices.
Yeah, they'll be able to hear you much more, more loudly.
A question about the material. What, is it a heavy cardboard or paper mache?
I'm not sure.
It's cardboard, I believe. I think in its original, this is the second version of it. They rebuilt it in the 70s, and I think its original iteration was cardboard.
And in the inside, there are kind of shoulder straps. So picture like a backpacking backpack. It's kind of those types of straps. Yes, the most uncomfortable, heavy ones you've ever
Yeah.
So this is a recreation, but was this actually worn in performance?
It was worn in performance, and this is actually, I think the last time in the 1990s, and this is what they would use now if they restaged the ballet. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, with that, we'll head on over to neoclassicism. Yeah, Picasso and neoclassicism. So when Picasso was working on Parade in 1917, he actually went to Italy with the Ballet Russe. And while he was there, he saw a lot of ancient ruins, thinking about, in particular, he visited Naples, Herculaneum, and Pompeii, and created his kind of own version of classicism, which we can see particular on this wall over here, with these very statuesque pictures and more sort of pastoral landscape. So he's drawing, but in a very sculptural way. And in this period, in part due to World War I, both he's living, it's happening during World War I, and then afterwards, he's really thinking about his own legacy, as one would do when you're surrounded kind of by death and mortality. And he is also feeling, that he's gone as far as he can with Cubism at that point. It obviously reoccurs later on in his life in different forms, but he moves more towards this this representational style that we see in the kind of Italian classicism. And then on this wall, we have really fantastic drawings that look more so at French neoclassicism, in particular the French artist Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, who was is still known as one of the greatest draftsmen to have ever lived. He lived in the 19th century, and you might be more familiar perhaps with his paintings, a lot of these very kind of slick, realistic portraits. But Picasso is drawing in a similar style and looking at people in his life and working through photographs. So we have his first wife, Olga Koklova, who was a dancer for the Ballet Russe, Igor Stravinsky, Auguste Renoir, we have Diaghilev and Alfred Seligsburg, and then you have, of course, Picasso himself. But the way that he's working and creating these images is really interesting. So Ingres did with a kind of a stretched paper or paper to hold taut and with graphite. And what Picasso is doing is actually he's created the image initially in graphite, erased it, and then gone over the lines in charcoal, and you get that very kind of sure, confident line that we see in these works, these very kind of pristine drawings. And so he's thinking about his place within the French tradition and in relation to one of the kind of great draftsmen of French tradition. Any questions before we move on?
You say he did portraits?
He works from photographs, yes.
Yeah. So one more.
Nothing projected.
So you mentioned that, did he cover the entire sheet with graphite and then pull out the
No, so he's creating graphite lines.
Actually, like, I'm just noticing you can actually see the technique in this drawing a little better. I never pointed this out in my notes, but it actually is doing
Yeah.
You can see like the sort of lines underneath.
It looks like he also rubbed it as well to get.
I think here he's like stumping the charcoal a little bit, so it's like a little bit different than the others. It's not quite as purely linear, but it's the same sort of concept. So you just erase the drawing, and then the lines like faintly remain, and so he goes back over them.
I mean, if you've ever erased with a pencil,
Yeah.
it doesn't completely erase. You can often see those faint lines there. It's a similar kind of
Yeah,
idea.
yeah.
I would say just a pro tip in terms of tours. I often, when I'm giving a tour, like I get to this point and I'm like, oh crap, I'm like way over. And so every once in a while I pace it really well and I can keep going. If I get to this point and I notice that I'm way over, what I will do is Jillian will make all the stops so you know what they are, but I'll go through the Surrealists, go into the 1936, the Warriors. And I'll talk about I'll just say we walked through Surrealism. You might not realize that Picasso was a Surrealist. Just say a few words about that without actually making a stop and then focus on the Warriors. So if you find yourself, without as much time as you hoped you would have once you get in this gallery, that's one sort of little strategy.
We're doing okay. It's 1:15,
Yes.
but we start a little late. So.
Yes.
But you're saying that that's a way for us to.
Yeah, I'm just saying, like if you get to this point and you realize that because we still have a lot.
You should be halfway through at this point.
You're less than half. Unfortunately.
No, but I mean, to time it right, you should be less than half the time.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm at the halfway point if I'm at a half hour in when I hit this point, then I know that I'm gonna be okay. But you'll have to but if you realize that it's just like you don't have enough time, you just gotta pick it up. That's one thing you do. You just walk through a gallery to say, you saw we just passed through a gallery, it has these works. We're going to take a closer look at the ones in the gallery that we're standing in right now. So you can mention it, but not make an official stop.
Yeah, and encourage people to stay beyond the tour. Like, your visitors, you can stay in the show all day.
Yeah, there's
if
a
you
question.
want.
So if they come on a tour, they can stay. Okay.
Or if you want to go back, if they stay, you could.
Yeah, and I think as long as they
Yeah.
have their paper ticket or on their phone, they can leave and come back in, and they just have to show.
They can, as far as I know.
I believe so. Yes.
Also, that reminds me that if you have people that are looking for restrooms on the tour, the restrooms
Oh, yeah,
in
that's
that
like a new
gallery
thing.
where fraud is are open, and that's
First time in a long.
Yeah, I've never seen those restrooms open. I keep forgetting that they're there. They don't have to go
Did you
upstairs.
say that people can come back in and out?
If they have their tickets, yes. Yeah.
You can also point them to Ingles Library if you're interested in learning more about Picasso in general, or if you're giving a tour before January 7th to Kristen's lecture, but I know a lot of the tours are going to be happening in the lecture. It's January 7th. It's a lunchtime lecture, January 7th at noon.
Yeah, we'll mention it again in the What's On newsletter. I think it was already mentioned.
Yeah.
I think, wasn't Kristen's lecture What's On?
I usually only mention things that are
Coming up. Yeah, so it'll be in an upcoming newsletter for
But it
that.
should be really good. She did a lot of research. It should be really, really good.
Yeah, and I'll double check that visitors can come back in, but I'm pretty sure
Yeah,
if you have tickets,
sure.
they can't throw you out.
No.
Once you're in, you're in.
I'm sure they could throw you out. They really
Well, yeah.
not for that.
I think this Engelman is primarily the kind of gallery designer. So he selected the colors in collaboration with Brittany. We also have then on this particular show Mary Thomas, who is the graphic designer who did kind of all of the label work, any of the banners or anything that you see would have been done by Mary. But they're working in collaboration with each other.
I went to high school with Jim, the designer, so yeah, we graduated from the same high school. So he's one of the other people I'd love to have do a training with you just to talk about what they do in exhibit design, and I think you'd enjoy hearing.
Yeah.
Will he also tell us about you in high school?
And what nerds we both were.
Yeah.
All right, so in this gallery we're looking at Picasso and Surrealism as well as his relationship with Marie Therese Walter. So as mentioned before, Picasso's art often mirrors his biography. And in 1927, he met a young woman by the name of Marie Therese Walter. She was 17 at the time. He was in his 40s, and he saw her in the Gallery Lafayette and asked to paint her. And they started a long kind of love affair, and she became a muse in his work. And we see these images of Marie Therese Walter there, as well as the sculpture just behind me. At the same time, Picasso is also engaging with some ideas of surrealism. He's never part of the surrealist group, although he sometimes exhibited work with them and was held up as a hero by the surrealists, but he never claimed to be one of them. You see some of the ideas that he's working through, so you see kind of the exploration of the unconscious and dreams, so thinking about this series behind you of the Minotaur. You also have the kind of continuous lines going through this large painting behind you. And then the kind of everyday objects made strange. So if you look at the cars over here, thinking about the one with nails, very similar to that man-made iron that we have up in the gallery, and the idea that if you were to strum this guitar, first of all, it would make a noise, and second, it would destroy your hand. So these everyday objects made strange. You also have kind of illogical forms. The favorite one for me to point out is this drawing in particular, in which he's numbered the different parts of Marie Therese Walter's face, and I just kind of imagine them walking off and then being reconstructed down here. This is also a period in which Picasso is really experimenting with printmaking. He acquires his own press and starts to print some of the works himself. You see with the etchings and dry points over here that he's experimenting with that. And you see also Marie Therese Walter's shape again reappearing first in drawing, printmaking, in sculpture, in painting. So her very distinctive nose was a kind of inspiration for him and a constant motif. Any questions before we move on? Picasso during the war years, and this section over here in particular looks at his most famous painting with, someone can't say it, Guernica. And while we don't have Guernica here, it doesn't travel, it lives in Madrid, we have this kind of reproduction of it as well. And Guernica was created in 1937. It was a commission from the Spanish Republican government during the Spanish Civil War. So in Spain, in this period, there was a Spanish Republican government that was, it's in the 1936 through 39. There was a Spanish Republican government that was democratically elected, but General Francisco Franco, a fascist, along with the military, performed a coup and took over the country, and the country was torn apart by civil war. Picasso at this time was living in Paris, and he didn't really think of himself as a political artist at this point in time, but the bombing of the Basque town of Guernica in April 1937 by the German Luftwaffe and the Italian Air Force on behalf of Francisco Franco's forces was this moment that really moved him. It was a bombing that had immense civilian casualties, and so he responded to that in part because of the bombing, because of this commission, and also at this moment, he was working with another artist who also became his lover. Her name was Dora Maar, so a famous surrealist and documentary photographer. And Dora Maar herself was incredibly political, and we believe that she encouraged Picasso in moving in this direction. So he was commissioned to create a painting for the 1937 World Fair in Paris by the Spanish Republican government. And so the image is depicting in this kind of cubist style, or not quite cubist style, but this abstracted style of the bombing of Guernica. And what we have on this wall is really kind of special. We have preparatory drawings by Picasso, thinking through the different motifs within Guernica. And we think of it in particular as this monochrome image, but you can see with this drawing here, at one point he was thinking about it as being in color. And we believe that it's possible, or we think that it's likely, that it was actually Picasso looking at Dora Maar's photographs, so she was documenting the painting's creation in the studio while he was making it, that when he saw these photographs in black and white, he was really struck by the images and took on that monochrome aspect into his painting as a sense of kind of documentation as well. And you can see in these wonderful photographs by Dora Maar, you can see the changes in the painting, and if you come close and look at them, you can actually see in this one in particular, there are collaged paper elements in Guernica in this period. So at one point, Picasso was thinking about including paper in this large painted work. And that actually brings us to the monumental work over here. We'll move over to look at it. So this is women at their toilette. It is, you see the kind of collage wallpaper elements here that Picasso was initially thinking about while creating Guernica. It's created around the same period, so a little bit later, 1937-38, and it was originally actually created for a tapestry design. But it stayed in Picasso's studio for quite a while and wasn't created, the tapestries weren't created until later. I believe, Brittany, do you remember if it was like the 60s or 70s? 70s, yeah. And it depicts, again, the women in Picasso's life. So you have Olga Koklova, his wife at the time, Dora Maar, the surrealist photographer who photographed Guernica and who he's also involved with, and then Marie-Thérèse Walter, we talked about in the Surrealism Gallery, holding a mirror, and we believe that the head inside the mirror is likely Picasso himself. So you see the ways that he is experimenting with these wallpapers that he collected and using them and integrating them into the composition. This is the first time that the work has come to the United States. You'll notice that we have the stanchions, and that's because it's unglazed. And it's rather fragile because of all of these wallpaper elements. But a really fantastic aspect of this exhibition was that we were able to conserve, or it was the Musée of Picasso in Paris, were able to conserve the work so that it can be out on view with us here. Right, any questions before we move on?
It would be hard, I think, for people just to keep moving.
It is hard. I think Brittany's done more tours than I have at this point, but you gotta encourage them to keep moving, and if they don't move with you, you gotta start talking. So in this gallery, we're in the 1950s and early 60s with Picasso really thinking about, again, his legacy and his place within the canon of art history. And he is responding to, copying, and in many ways parodying some of the great masters of 19th century French art, in particular Delacroix and Manet. So we have on this side over here, we have works pertaining to the women of Algeria by Delacroix, which you see on the left-hand side there, a reproduction of that work of the great kind of French Romantic master. And then on this side here, we have him playing with the déjeuner sur l'air, or the luncheon on the grass, by Manet, the Impressionist artist. And this painting in particular, you'll probably remember, created great controversy because it showed female nude figures and clothed male figures. But you have Picasso playing through with both of these artists in multiple media, often with paper. So we have sketchbooks over here in which you see him looking at both of these paintings and copying them. We have drawings and a linocut as well, the paintings and drawings, and then we have these, which people definitely curious about, these kind of paper cutouts that we made of the different figures. We made it after the painting. It's another one of those kind of fun, sometimes childlike ways that Picasso's playing with paper. And these were actually made later through a collaboration with a Norwegian sculptor into monumental concrete sculptures. There's an image of them on the label on the other side that are now at the Modern Museum in Stockholm. So they're actually outside on the grass, and we have a giant kind of luncheon on the grass. And on this side again, you see him looking at Delacroix and working through this composition of the femmes salvaires, or the women of Algeria, in different media. We have him experimenting with printmaking on this wall, in aquatint and photography, and then going through different drawing techniques and painting. Any questions?
Do we know how he arrived?
All right, in this gallery, we're looking at Picasso's materials and techniques. So he was constantly experimenting with different materials, different printmaking techniques, some of which were unfamiliar even to print specialists such as myself and Brittany. But one of the really kind of fun things I think to point out to people is this case here in particular, because it gives you an idea of Picasso's everyday life in some ways. So Picasso collected scraps of paper, collected everything. You might even imagine him to some extent as a hoarder. He had stacks of paper in his studio, and when he didn't have space for it, he began to actually clip them and hang them from the ceiling. And so there's paper kind of everywhere in his life. We have some really wonderful examples here. We have a crumpled piece of paper that has been made into a plaster cast. We have some paper sample notebooks, as well as drawings on envelopes and kind of cards sent to friends. And this is a really interesting and fun object as well. He actually created this print of a matador using the bottom of a salad bowl. So he actually burned into the salad bowl and printed it, and you can see the kind of curved parts of the bowl just there. So we can see Picasso was incredibly experimental, and paper was often this material that inspired him to be experimental because he was constantly surrounded by it. It was a constant part of his life. And you get very close with these ephemeral materials to Picasso's everyday life. All right, we're going to move on to that side of the gallery. This is still materials about experimentation, but it's also related to a specific movie called Mystère de Picasso, so the mystery of Picasso, that was a collaboration between Picasso and a French filmmaker, Clouseau. And we have several pieces by Picasso in the exhibition that are paired with screens that are excerpts from the film. So I like to point out this one in particular because we can see the creation and all of them, but this one is really interesting and fun. So we're seeing it much as it would have been set up for the film. So it's a piece of paper, it's kind of like newsprint without the actual print on it. So it's not a high quality paper that would have been mounted in this, not in this specific way, vertically like this. You have the filmmaker Clouseau on one side and Picasso on the other. And Picasso is using felt tip markers at this point, or felt tip pens that had just been invented or actually imported from America for this film. And so it's exploring the kind of imagination of the artist, but also we see this new kind of experimentation with materials. This is another one of the objects that was conserved for the exhibition. Some of the drawings from the movie were long thought to be lost, but they were actually in the collection of the Musée Picasso Paris, which has the largest collection of Picasso's work. His studio, the estate, went to the French state after his death, and they have masses and masses of archives. I was just telling you about Picasso the Hoarder. Could you imagine having to sort through all of that material? But it's really wonderful that they've been conserved for this exhibition.
So at the opening of the exhibition, there's this photograph. I presume that's a photograph of the filmmaker filming him making a drawing?
Yeah, it's from the film like right around the corner.
So-
The clip is right around the corner here.
Yeah.
The film is running.
So
Oh, okay.
there are three works. You have the collage over here that's paired with this screen. You have this double-sided drawing. It's where the ink has seeped through. That's why it's double-sided. You can draw on both sides. You see in this one here, and then there's another double-sided drawing with a larger screen, and it has this really kind of funny narrative. You see really Picasso. This is a myth-building moment in which he is showing his kind of creativity. We did not talk about them. There's a really wonderful wall as we were walking by with portraits of two women, and then there's two kind of cubist still lives. And so that's in relation to Françoise Giraud. So there's a wonderful portrait of her. She is, again, one of Picasso's partners. She was much younger than him, and she, like Dora Maar, there are also photographs, really wonderful photographs from our collection by Dora Maar in that back corner. Over there, where you see Picasso's experimentation with photography, you'll see with things I'm telling you right now, we're only getting a taste of the exhibition, and you'll only really be able to offer a taste of the exhibition that will hopefully get people to spend more time